Prologue, written and narrated by Dolphin Lines. It was a late, rainy evening in April of 1965, but then again it was normal to the engines at Hawick Sheds in Scotland. Most of them were trying to sleep through it, but not all of them. 2 engines were still awake and chatting about the day. One of them was number 76115, who was a BR Standard 4 260 Mogul. The other was a Standard 4MT tank engine, number 80139. They were discussing recent events, and truthfully, they were very nervous. They spoke in hushed voices. "Did you hear about what happened yesterday?" the tank engine asked, and the Mogul replied, "No, what's happened?" "One of the Class 5s was retired. He's very likely to be scrapped." 76115 was horrified by this. "Oh no, who was it? Do you know?" she asked. "I think it was 73149, one of the ones with the Caprotti valve gear." "I was wondering where he was. I wouldn't have seen him all day. Oh God, this is terrible." "You knew him then?" "Aye. He would wish me good morning before leaving for his first train. Why did they withdraw him?" The tank engine simply gawked at her before answering in a harsh manner. "Why do you think? It's this bloody modernization scheme. They should be tried for mass murder, and with all the steam engines they've scrapped so far and are planning to scrap in the future." "But why are they scrapping us now? Why go through the border, building us and then turning around and scrapping us?" "I don't know, but I thought I was going to get more than just 10 years when I was built. And you never know when we're getting withdrawn. It's not fair at all, I tell you. And these damn diesels are not helping. Those bastards are cheering and taunting." As if on cue, a Class 17 diesel came rushing past with a freight train in tow. "Your friend crawled for you in the scrapyard, Steamy. It's a pity you couldn't help him." And before the other engines could retort, the diesel and his train were gone. 80139 fumed at the mockery. That diesel wouldn't be laughing if it was one of his own class brothers. The nerve of such an engine! Who the hell was building these boxes on wheels? Satan? His thoughts were interrupted, though, when he heard the soft sobbing and a sniff from beside him. He turned his gaze and settled on the depressed 76115, who had started crying. So he leaned over a little and spoke softly to try to soothe her. "Hey, don't let that thing get to you. These diesels will say anything to hurt you." But 76115 looked to him with watery eyes, sniffed again, and protested. "Why? Why do they say such hurtful things? Why have we been scrapped? We're still useful." 80139 said nothing. How could he answer that? It seemed to be without good rhyme or reason, at least beyond cost-cutting and appeasing people whining about soot and smoke. As for why the diesels were acting in such a horrid way, he didn't have an answer for that either. All he could do was just sit there and try to comfort her as best he could. As time went on, things didn't improve for poor 76115. She tried to struggle on, but more and more she found she couldn't keep up with the demands, and they seemed to be piling higher and higher on her. It didn't help that her upkeep began to fall in quality. She became dirtier and dirtier with each train she pulled. Finally, on the 25th, the shedmaster called for her to approach him and leave the others at the shed, so that he could speak to her in private. She puffed out of the shed and followed the man to a building at the far end of the yard. It's a common myth that the locomotives needed a crew to move on their own, but that wasn't true. She could move just fine by herself. But she wished she had them to comfort her, especially when the shedmaster took a breath. "Before I begin, I want you to know that you have been one of my best engines," he began. 76115 could already tell where this was going, and began to cry softly. "But unfortunately, despite my best efforts to try to keep you going, I'm afraid today is going to be your last day. The higher-ups are withdrawing you from service. I'm very sorry this is happening. I wish I could prevent it. 76115 was not the first engine the Shedmaster had to inform of their retirement, and she certainly won't be the last. But in the 10 years of working here, the mogul had earned herself a soft spot in the Shedmaster's heart. Unfortunately, sentimentality didn't really have much place in this new, modern railway. Soon, her crying became sobbing, and the Shedmaster placed his hand onto her buffer. It was warm and soothing, but no amount of either of those were going to help this poor engine from her fate, or relieve her of her overwhelming sadness. The next day was pretty uneventful. She kept the news to herself and focused on getting her work done. She passed many stations and industrial sites, but she couldn't bring herself to look at them one last time. She just stared at the rails she ran on, with feelings of emptiness and sorrow. Eventually, her last job was complete. She was backed into a siding, her fire was dropped, and her water tank slowly drained. Her crew said their last goodbyes and walked off as a diesel came to take her away. Good night, everyone. I'll miss you. 76115 didn't know what scrapyard she was taken to, where it was, or how long she had even been there. But she did not like the place. It was dark and shadowy. The only lights came from where a locomotive was being taken. It was another Standard 4, like her, but he seemed to have been here for longer. She watched helplessly as a small shunting diesel pushed him into place, and she was thankful that her view was mostly blocked by a large pile of metal pieces. But today, she wished she was deaf as well, because the black ooze that was often used to put engines to sleep before cutting were not effective on this engine, who screamed in agony before he was muffled. But then, another scream came, no doubt from one of the scrappers. She couldn't tell what had happened. Maybe the cutter burnt himself, or maybe, heaven forbid, the engine actually bit one of them. She prayed that wasn't what happened, but her hopes were dashed when both screaming stopped. She could barely see the man walk away, but his forearm was completely gone, and the man walked past in pain. It was not a case of carelessness with the torch. That engine had actually bit the man's forearm off. It was grotesque, bloody, and horrifying. He may have been a scrapper, but the man was only doing his job. He didn't deserve to lose his arm. But then again, the engine was in agonizing pain. The black goo had indeed failed to put him to sleep. She couldn't really blame him for lashing out. But that certainly put a stop to the work for a while, and as nightfall came, everyone went home and the scrapyard was silent, save for the quiet murmuring of the engines destined for scrap. Most were on the side of the Standard 4, while others held on to the unwritten rule that locomotives should never attack a human, no matter the circumstance. 76115 just didn't know what to think. So instead, she just closed her eyes and tried to sleep. 76115 opened her eyes to the sound of screaming. She looked all around and found that while still inside the scrapyard, she was completely alone. No engines, no people, nothing to keep her company. The rain began to pour heavier than she could remember in her life. "Oh, hello. There is someone out there," she called out. There was no reply. Then she heard it again. A scream. The same scream from before. 76115 tried to move, and found that she could, so she ventured deeper into the yards to see if she could find the source of the scream. As she ventured deeper into the yards, toward the smelter's building, She surveyed her surroundings. She found that she was still alone, save for the rusty, faceless husks of dead locomotives. She became more and more uneasy as she ventured, but for some reason she continued on. Soon she came to the smelter's building, where the screaming was louder and the doors were shut in front of her. The air grew cold as she came near, and there was a faint orange light that came from the bottom of the door, as if there was a bright light inside of the building. It was at this point where she decided to try to run away, but as she backed up, she hit something. The bum sent her scurrying forward until she abruptly stopped right in front of the doors and flung open. Inside, she saw the burning gates of hell itself open up like a maw to swallow her whole. She tried to reverse again, but almost instantly she bumped into the waiting buffers of something, and that something began to push her toward the fire.
No, please no.
She was pushed further and further toward the fire, and she let out one loud scream as the fires consumed her. Oi, cop! 76115 awoke with a start and looked all around her. What she saw was she hadn't moved from her original spot. All of the engines that were with her the night before were still there, and before her stood two men. One was the scrapyard manager. The other was a well-dressed, tall, thin man with a white beard. The engine took a moment to settle herself down and focus on the man in question. The manager then turned to the man and spoke dismissively. You sure you want this engine? It seems a bit shell-shocked. And then the gentleman spoke, and he did so with an accent she had only heard in those Western movies the Shedmaster would show them on weekends. It was an American accent, a Southern one. Well, let's see. Hello there, 76115. Are you all right there? 76115 was surprised by this. Did she hear the manager correctly? Did this man want her? For what? She stammered for the words to reply. Yes, I think so. It seems like I had a bad dream. Who are you, sir? The gentleman smiled warmly at her, like a parent to a frightened child, and he removed his hat as he introduced himself. My name's John Wilkins. I am in need of an engine for my railroad, the Chicago, Atlanta, and Gulf Coast. 76115 raised her eyebrows in disbelief. A British engine on American rails? What a crazy idea. From what she heard from the engines who knew the USATC S-160s and their accounts, British engines were downright puny in size and strength compared to even some of the smaller American ones. But Mr. Wilkins chuckled at her expression. I know, strange, isn't it? But it's true. I'm looking to purchase 2 British engines to run a branch line in Florida. The line is in rough terrain that can't be upgraded to hold anything American beyond tank engines and old Civil War engines. The work is getting too much for 'em, but y'all should be able to do it just fine. So what do you say? You interested? 76115 was absolutely speechless. An engine next to her whispered desperately, Speak, Scotty, speak! 76115 tried hard to force the words out. The sheer bewilderment made it difficult. She began to laugh and cry at once, but finally she did get the words she wanted out. It would be an honor, sir. When can I start? As soon as I can get you delivered and modified. Your partner is waiting outside to take you away. The other engines gave her 3 cheers. They knew they may not be able to escape the scrapyard, but it brought peace to all of their hearts to know that at least one of them was granted a new lease on life. 76115 didn't even know what her job was going to be, but whatever it was, she would gladly do it. She promised to herself that she would do whatever it took to never be put in a scrapyard again. She had a new home awaiting her in America, the land of opportunity. It took a little while to clear a path for her, but when it was, she was delighted to see that her new partner was an LNER V2 named Dorothy, and she had 3 BR Mark I carriages and 1 Mark I mini buffet. After a week of waiting in a rented shed and some last-minute repairs to any damaged part they may have had, the 2 engines and the carriages were loaded onto a ship and they made their way to their new home. But that wasn't the only gift she had been given. Mr. Wilkins saw fit to give her a name, and after the name of his late wife, 76115 became known as Mary. She and Dorothy got along swimmingly in their time together, with Mr. Wilkins telling them his story about his climb through the ranks in the CA and GC, and how he became the railroad president. Both engines were amazed, and couldn't wait until they could leave their own marks on the railroad more commonly known as the Dolphin line.